Is this some kind of joke? The voice was young, sharp, and dripping with the unearned confidence that only a freshly starched uniform can provide. Corporal Davis, all of 21 years and 6 months, a United States Marine, stood with his hands on his hips, looking down at the old man seated on a simple folding chair. The vast olive-drab canvas of the general-purpose tent muffled the sounds of the base's annual open house, creating an intimate stage for the confrontation. Harold Winters, 89 years old, didn't move. His hands, latticed with the roadmap of a long life, rested on his knees. He wore simple khaki pants and a faded blue polo shirt, a stark contrast to the crisp desert camouflage worn by the young Marine before him. Harold's gaze was fixed on a point somewhere beyond the canvas wall, a placid look on his face that seemed to infuriate the corporal even more. "Hey, I'm talking to you, old man," Davis pressed, his voice rising. Two other young Marines, his friends, chuckled behind him, their posture mimicking his own brand of casual arrogance. "This area is for active duty personnel and their families. Did you get lost on your way to the bingo hall?" The small crowd milling around the historical displays began to take notice. Conversations dwindled as heads turned. A mother pulled her young son a little closer. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. Davis felt the eyes on him and seemed to swell with the attention, misinterpreting discomfort for audience approval. He saw himself as a guardian of a sacred space, a protector of the Corps' modern image. And this quiet, unimpressive old man was an unwelcome relic. "I'm going to need to see some identification," Davis said, puffing out his chest. "Base regulations. We can't just have anyone wandering in here." Slowly, deliberately, Harold Winters turned his head. His eyes, a pale but clear blue, finally met the corporal's. There was no anger in them, no fear, only a profound and unsettling stillness, like the calm at the center of a storm. He reached into his back pocket and produced a worn leather wallet. It seems frayed, and the leather softened by decades of use. He fumbled for a moment with the plastic sleeves inside, his fingers not as nimble as they once were. Davis let out an impatient sigh. "Come on, Grandpa, we don't have all day. What are you, 100? Just pull out your driver's license so I can call you a cab." The insult hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The crowd's murmur grew a little louder now, a current of disapproval running through it. Harold finally extracted a state-issued ID card and handed it to the Marine. Davis snatched it from his hand. He glanced at it dismissively. "Harold Winters. Well, Harold, it says here you're a resident of Northwood. That doesn't give you clearance to be in this tent." He held the ID between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something soiled. He was about to hand it back when his eyes caught something else on the old man's simple attire. A small, tarnished pin was affixed to the collar of his polo shirt. It was dull, lacking the polished gleam of official military insignia. It looked like a piece of junk, a forgotten trinket from a flea market. "What's that supposed to be?" Davis sneered, pointing a finger at the pin. "Did you get that for perfect attendance at the senior center? Some kind of prize for finishing your oatmeal?" His friends laughed, a harsh, braying sound that echoed under the canvas. The humiliation was thick and palpable now. The crowd watched, frozen between the urge to intervene and the reluctance to challenge a uniformed Marine. They saw an arrogant young man bullying a defenseless senior citizen. They saw a clear and simple injustice. Davis, high on his own perceived authority, was oblivious. He felt powerful, righteous. He was upholding the standard. For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Harold's placid features. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. A shadow of a memory stirred by the mockery of the small object on his collar. He didn't see the sneering face of Corporal Davis anymore. The world dissolved into a blast of white. The humid air of the tent was replaced by a cold so sharp it felt like swallowing glass. He was 20 years old again, his knuckles raw and bleeding inside his frozen gloves. The sky was a sheet of iron gray over the barren, snow-covered hills of North Korea. The sound wasn't the laughter of young Marines, but the crump of distant artillery and the whistling of a wind that cut through his thin fatigues like a surgeon's scalpel. He was kneeling next to his platoon leader, Captain Richards, a good man who was trying very hard not to die from the shrapnel that had torn through his chest. The captain's breathing was a ragged, wet rattle. With a trembling hand, Richards fumbled at his own collar, removing a small makeshift pin he had fashioned himself from a piece of a shattered radio antenna. He pressed the cold metal into Harold's palm. "You held the line, Winters. You held the damn line all by herself," the captain had rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Don't you ever forget what we did here." The pin was worthless to anyone else on Earth. To Harold, it was more sacred than any medal. "Sir, are you okay?" The voice pulled him back to the present. Harold blinked, the memory receding like a phantom tide. The face in front of him now was not mocking. It was a man in his late 30s, his uniform showing the chevrons of a gunnery sergeant, his name tag read Raya's. He had been watching from the edge of the display area, his face a mask of growing concern. Davis, annoyed by the interruption, turned on the senior NCO. "I've got this, Gunny. This man is trespassing." Gunnery Sergeant Reyes ignored him. He kept his eyes on Harold. "Sir, my name is Gunnery Sergeant Reyes. Is this corporal giving you a hard time?" Before Harold could answer, Davis stepped between them. "With all due respect, Gunny, this is my situation to handle. I'm ensuring base security. This individual has no business being here and refuses to explain himself." Reyes's eyes narrowed. He was a career Marine, a man who had seen combat in 2 different deserts and had forgotten more about the Corps than Davis would ever learn. He knew the look of a true hard man when he saw one. And it wasn't the puffed-up bravado of the corporal. It was the unnerving calm of the old man in the polo shirt. Something was profoundly wrong here. Reyes had seen the whole exchange, the escalating disrespect, the mocking of the small pin. He didn't recognize the insignia, but he recognized the quiet dignity with which the old man wore it. He had a sudden gut-wrenching feeling that this young corporal was dancing on a landmine and was about to take them all with him. "Corporal," Reyes said, his voice low and dangerous, "stand down and step away." "I will not, Gunny," Davis shot back, his arrogance now curdling into outright insubordination. "I'm waiting for the MPs. I'm not letting this guy just walk away." Reyes knew he couldn't physically intervene without causing a bigger scene. He gave Davis a look that promised a world of pain later, then took a discreet step back, pulling his phone from his pocket. He kept his voice low, turning away from the scene as he dialed the number for the base command post. "This is Gunnery Sergeant Reyes at the Fleet Week Historical Exhibit GP 104, he said quietly into the phone. "I have a situation. A Corporal Davis is harassing an elderly civilian. The situation is escalating." He paused, listening. "Yes, I have his name." The corporal made him show his ID. He glanced over his shoulder at the ID still clutched in Davis's hand. "The gentleman's name is Harold Winters. That's Winters, Harold." He turned back to watch as Davis continued his tirade, unaware that a phone call had just sealed his fate. The witness had acted. The gears of a machine far larger and more powerful than Corporal Davis could ever imagine had just begun to turn. The cavalry was on its way. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of the base command center, Master Sergeant Frank Miller took the call. He was a man who processed information with methodical calm, the unflappable nerve center of the entire installation. He listened to Gunnery Sergeant Reyes, his pen making neat little notes on a pad. A corporal harassing a civilian. Unfortunate, but not a crisis. He'd dispatch a patrol to de-escalate. "Spell that name for me again, Gunny," he said, his fingers poised over his keyboard. "Winters, U-N-I-S, first name Harold." Miller typed the name into the National Military Personnel Database, a system that contained the records of nearly every service member since the First World War. He expected to find a routine service record, maybe a short enlistment from the 50s or 60s. He hit enter. The result loaded instantly. Miller stared at the screen. He read it once. He read it a second time. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the desk. He stood up so abruptly that his rolling chair shot backward and slammed into a metal filing cabinet with a loud bang that made everyone in the room jump. The officer of the deck, a young, sharp-faced captain named Evans, looked over. "Everything all right, Master Sergeant?" Miller didn't answer. He couldn't. He just pointed a trembling finger at his monitor. "Sir," he croaked, his voice strained, "you need to see this right now." Captain Evans walked over, a look of mild annoyance on his face. He peered at the screen. The annoyance vanished, replaced by a wave of disbelief, then dawning horror. His face went pale. Under the name Harold Winters was a service history that read like a legend, a list of commendations and honors that was almost impossible. And at the very top, next to a black and white photograph of a serious young man in a dress uniform, was a single, stark designation: Medal of Honor. Evans grabbed the phone from Miller's desk. "Gunny Reyes, this is Captain Evans at command. What is your exact location?" His voice was tight with an urgency that bordered on panic. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not under any circumstances let Mr. Winters leave. I mean the civilian. Your new mission is to ensure his safety and comfort. Is that understood? The base commandant is on his way to you personally. I repeat, the general is en route to your location." Back in the GP tent, Corporal Davis had reached the peak of his arrogant power trip. He was now fully convinced of his own righteousness. The old man's silence, the crowd's hesitation, the gunnery sergeant's retreat, he saw it all as a validation of his actions. He was the authority here. "All right, that's it, old man," Davis declared, his voice ringing with finality. He gestured at Harold as if he were a piece of evidence. "You're a security risk. You're being evasive. You're causing a public disturbance. And frankly, I think you might be confused." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a tone of mock concern. "For your own safety, I'm detaining you until the military police arrive. They can get you the help you need. Maybe a nice quiet room for a psychological evaluation." This was his final move, the ultimate assertion of his dominance. He was going to have this senile old man committed. He reached out, his fingers preparing to wrap around Harold's thin arm to pull him to his feet, but his hand never made it. A sound from outside cut through the tense atmosphere of the tent. It started as a distant whine, but quickly grew into the unmistakable piercing wail of a full military police escort. It wasn't the sound of a single patrol car, it was a convoy. Tires screeched on the pavement just outside the tent's main flap. Car doors slammed open and shut with military precision. Heavy-booted footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. The crowd inside the tent turned as one toward the entrance. Corporal Davis froze, his hand hovering in the air, a look of confusion on his face. He had called for the MPs, but this response was excessive. The tent flap was thrown open with force. Two uniformed MPs entered first, their sidearms holstered, but their hands resting near them. They didn't look at Davis. They looked past him, their eyes scanning the tent before they moved to either side of the entrance, standing at a rigid parade rest. Then a figure strode through the opening, and a collective gasp went through the crowd. It was Major General Marcus Thorne, the base commandant, a two-star general, a man whose face was usually only seen on official portraits or during base-wide ceremonies. His uniform was immaculate, his chest a formidable wall of ribbons, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He moved with an aura of absolute authority that made Corporal Davis's earlier posturing look like a child playing dress-up. General Thorne's eyes, like chips of granite, swept across the scene. They passed over the stunned crowd, flickered with utter contempt over the pale-faced Corporal Davis and his friends, and then settled on the old man in the folding chair. Harold Winters had, slowly, with the stiffness of his age, begun to push himself to his feet. The general didn't hesitate. He strode across the tent, his polished boots making no sound on the dusty floor. The crowd instinctively parted before him. He walked directly to Harold, stopping precisely 3 feet away. In the sudden tomb-like silence of the tent, General Thorne's body went rigid. He raised his right hand to his brow and executed the sharpest, most profound salute of his 30-year career. It was a gesture of such deep and unambiguous respect that it sent a shockwave through every person present. "Sergeant Major Winters," the general's voice boomed, clear and strong, resonating in the stillness. "It is an absolute honor to have you on my base, sir." The title hung in the air. Sergeant Major, sir, directed at the old man in the polo shirt. Corporal Davis's jaw dropped. His face, which had been pale, was now the color of ash. The entire tent had fallen so silent you could have heard a pin drop. The only sound was the faint hum of a generator somewhere outside. General Thorne held his salute, his eyes locked on Harold's. He then turned his head slightly, addressing the entire captive audience. "For those of you who do not know," he began, his voice ringing with the pride of a historian reciting a sacred text, "you are in the presence of a genuine American hero." Sergeant Major Harold Winters is a veteran of the 1st Marine Division. He served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. Then he continued, his voice growing in intensity. "At the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950, then Staff Sergeant Winters found his platoon pinned down, their officer killed, and their flank about to be overrun by an enemy force that outnumbered them 20-1. With temperatures 40 degrees below zero and his machine gun frozen solid, he single-handedly charged the enemy position. And armed with only his entrenching tool and 6 grenades, he broke their assault, held the line for 17 hours until reinforcements could arrive, and is credited with saving the lives of more than 100 Marines." A woman in the crowd gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. An older man wearing a Vietnam veteran cap slowly, reverently got to his feet. "For his actions on that day," the general concluded, his voice thick with emotion, "for his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, Harold Winters was awarded the Medal of Honor." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer tense or awkward. It was a profound, hallowed quiet. It was the sound of 100 people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of the man they had just seen being humiliated. Tears welled in the eyes of onlookers. Cell phones were raised, not to record a confrontation, but to capture the image of a living legend. Every veteran in the tent, regardless of their age or branch of service, was now on their feet, their posture straightened, their eyes fixed on Harold. They weren't just standing, they were bearing witness. Finally, General Thorne lowered his hand. He looked at Harold, his expression softening from rigid formality to one of deep personal reverence. Harold gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Then the general turned. His gaze fell upon Corporal Davis, and the warmth vanished, replaced by an arctic cold. His voice, when he spoke again, was not loud. It was a low, terrifyingly calm murmur that was somehow more menacing than any shout could ever be. "Corporal Davis," he said, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "In my 3 decades in the United States Marine Corps, I have never been more ashamed than I am at this moment. You wear a uniform that men like this bled for, that they died for. You stand in a tradition that he helped build with his own hands, with his own sacrifice. And you use that uniform to mock him. You use the authority it gave you to humiliate a man to whom you and I and every person in this country owe a debt that can never be repaid." Davis was trembling, unable to speak, unable to even meet the general's eyes. "You are a disgrace to your rank, to your unit, and to the eagle, globe, and anchor you so clearly do not understand." The general then turned his head slightly. "Gunnery Sergeant Reyes?" "Yes, General." Reyes snapped to attention. "Thank you for having the integrity and situational awareness that seems to have completely eluded this corporal. Escort Davis and his friends to my office. I will deal with them myself. Their time on my base is at an end." As Reyes moved to comply, a quiet voice cut through the air. "General," it was Harold. All eyes turned back to him. "He's just a boy," Harold said, his voice gentle but firm. "We were all young and stupid once, full of fire and not enough sense. Maybe the boy doesn't need to be broken. Maybe he just needs to be taught." General Thorne looked from Harold's compassionate face to Davis's terrified one. He considered the old man's words, a look of profound respect in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "As you wish, Sergeant Major. He will be taught." As he stood there, his simple polo shirt seeming more dignified than any uniform, Harold's eyes drifted down to the small tarnished pin on his collar, the object that had started it all. The memory flashed again, not with the violence of combat, but with the quiet solemnity of its aftermath. He was in a field hospital. Captain Richards lay on a cot, his life slipping away. The pin, a jagged piece of metal from a radio shattered in the firefight, was in the captain's hand. "Don't let them forget, Winters," the dying man had whispered, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Don't let them forget the cost of this ground, this pin. It's not for a parade, it's for remembering." It was not an award. It was a promise, a burden of memory he had carried for over 70 years. It was a reminder that the greatest honors are not those that gleam on a uniform, but those carried silently in the heart. Corporal Davis was not discharged. General Thorne, honoring Harold's request, chose a different path for him. He was reassigned from his unit and enrolled in a mandatory one-on-one remedial training program. His instructor was a retired master gunnery sergeant, a grizzled veteran of Fallujah who had lost a leg in combat. For 3 months, Davis's life was not about drills or marksmanship. It was about history. He spent his days in the base library, reading battle reports from Iwo Jima, Incheon, and Quezon. He spent his evenings cleaning and maintaining the displays at the base museum. His final exam was to write a personal history of 3 Medal of Honor recipients, one of whom was Harold Winters. He was being taught. 6 months later, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Harold was sitting at a small table in his local FEW hall, nursing a cup of coffee. The door opened and a young man in civilian clothes walked in, looking nervous and out of place. It was the former Corporal Davis. He walked over to Harold's table and stood there for a long moment, struggling to find words. Finally he spoke, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mr. Winters, sir, I came to apologize. What I did, there's no excuse for it. I was arrogant and I was ignorant, and I am so deeply sorry for the disrespect I showed you." Tears welled in his eyes. Harold looked up at the young man. He saw no trace of the cocky corporal from the GP tent. He saw a humbled boy who had been forced to grow up fast. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son," Harold said, his voice kind. "Tell me what you've learned on the base." The incident led to the creation of a new mandatory program for all incoming personnel. It was called the Winters Initiative. Every new Marine from the lowest private to the highest ranking officer was now required to spend 1 day a month with veterans from local VFW and American Legion posts, listening to their stories, learning from them, and ensuring that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. The aim was simple: to make sure no one ever looked at an old man in a polo shirt and failed to see the giant standing before them. Thank you for watching. If this story of valor and humility moved you, please consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And for more true stories of our nation's unassuming heroes, make sure to subscribe to Military Stories. We'll see you next time.